All right. I'm so excited to have you on the show, Melanie. I've been following your work for so many years. And I think some of this new stuff you're doing might be the most important stuff yet, because there's so many huge problems our society is facing, whether it's war, obviously animal abuse. But at the root of a lot of the problems we're seeing in society and certainly in social movements is just the relationships we have with each other. Um, and so maybe we can start. Can you just tell me and tell the audience, what is relational literacy and why is it so important to you?
Yeah, sure. First of all, thank you. I'm like really, really looking forward to this conversation as well. And yeah, so relational literacy is the understanding of and ability to practice healthy ways of relating. And I believe that it is absolutely foundational to everything else that we do. Our activism, advocacy is just like massively improved when we improve our relational literacy, even just by a small amount. Now, when you think of some of the most pressing problems in our personal lives, but also in our world, right? Like, war, poverty, animal exploitation, patriarchy, racism, domestic violence, toxic workplaces, climate change. You can see that these problems share a common denominator. And this common denominator is relational dysfunction or dysfunctional ways of relating, right? Relating to other humans, relating as social groups, relating to other animals, relating to the environment, and even relating to ourselves. We're always relating to ourselves. So our primary relationship is with ourselves, right? So
Mm-hmm.
we relate to ourselves through our self-talk, which is going on, frequently throughout the day, and through the choices that we make that influence, that impact our future selves. And so, given that relational dysfunction is a common denominator in all of these problems, building relational literacy is a common denominator in helping transform these problems. And when we build relational literacy, we have healthier relationships, interpersonal relationships, romantic relationships, and relationships in our workplaces and relationships in our movement. You can see, like, we look at many social justice movements, including the animal rights movement, or, what I would call the animal justice movement, suffer from infighting. And
Mm-hmm.
infighting, when you really deconstruct it and look at it, is really reflects relational dysfunction, people relating to each other in a way that causes problems, that causes disconnection.
Yeah. So I read this political science article recently, and I'm forgetting the exact title, but it was something along the lines of, in modern times, people are defined by who they hate. I was like, whoa. And this is kind of, and it made me think of your work, because a lot of your work is about how we should probably stop doing that, because it's really interesting, because I'm massively overly educated, because my parents were, I was just telling you about how my mom was a tiger mom, and I went to college very young. I learned calculus when I was like 12 years old. So but one of the things I was never taught was just how to interact properly with other people. And we're taught to read and write, we're taught math, and we know these skills are actually pretty important,
Right.
just navigating the world. You cannot navigate the world without learning how to read and write. But honestly, especially in modern times where we don't actually need to learn how to do math. Even reading and writing, maybe ChatGPT is going to read and write for us in the future. One thing that we absolutely will need to do in the future, and that really is driving both success and failure for a lot of people, is just how we relate to others. And yet we're not taught these things.
Yeah,
So it's
totally.
kind of shocking, and it leads to, what you describe as dysfunction on your website. But maybe can you just describe, what do you mean by relational dysfunction?
Yeah. So what I like when I talk about relational literacy is made up of a number of principles and tools. I mean, the good news is that it can be learned by anybody who really wants to learn it. It's not rocket science. The information is out there. And all of these principles and tools are based on one core formula. I call this the formula for healthy relating. So in a healthy interaction or a healthy relationship, relationships are basically just a series of interactions, right? And when I say interaction, I'm also talking about communication. And if you think about it, communication is the primary way we relate. And so most relational dysfunction shows up through our communication. And of course, most communication today happens online. And this is where we see
Mm-hmm.
most most of the dysfunction, not surprisingly. And online spaces are actually constructed to increase the chances that we will communicate in ways that are dysfunctional. So let me tell you what the formula for healthy relating is, and then we can talk about it. It'll make clear what relational dysfunction is. So in a healthy interaction, we practice integrity and honor dignity. So these two components, right? By practice integrity, I simply mean practicing integrity is the integration of our core values and our practices, our behaviors, practicing the core values of compassion and justice. So when you practice your integrity, you're essentially treating another individual or yourself, when you're relating to yourself, the way that you would want to be treated if you were in their position. This is essentially the practice of respect. Dignity is our sense of inherent or intrinsic worth. When you honor someone's dignity, that means you see them and treat them as no less worthy of being treated with compassion, with respect, than anybody else on the planet. You honor their dignity, you perceive and treat them as being fundamentally worthy. When we practice integrity and honor dignity, this leads to a sense of connection and security. So if you or listeners just think about a relationship in your life that you would consider a good relationship, chances are you trust that other person practices integrity toward you, and you feel that they honor your dignity. You don't feel that they look down and see you as an inferior being, as less worthy of being treated, to simplify this, being treated with respect, with compassion, than anybody else on the planet. And chances are you feel a sense of connection and security with them. Now, the opposite is violating integrity, harming dignity, and this leads us to feel disconnected and insecure. So again, if you think about a relationship that's not healthy, and maybe it's with somebody you've never met, like an online troll, chances are you don't trust that they practice integrity toward you. You don't feel that they honor your dignity. You feel that they harm your dignity. They look down on you and see you as inferior, less worthy or unworthy of being treated with compassion. And chances are you feel disconnected from them and insecure in their presence. And so, and like most things in life, the formula is not all or nothing, right? It's not that a behavior is either healthy / relational or unhealthy / non-relational or dysfunctional. It's more or less so. So when you ask about what relational dysfunction looks like, a relationally dysfunctional behavior, this is a relationally unhealthy behavior, or what I call a non-relational behavior, it's just different ways of saying the same thing, is one in which we violate the formula. So we act against our integrity, we harm dignity, we create a sense of insecurity and disconnection.
Yeah. I want to come back to this question about how social media is affecting this. But I will just say that I feel very guilty when you say these things and you mention social media, because not entirely, because I do think I'm trying to push back against this to some degree with my own social media work. But for example, it's just widely known that if you make a thumbnail on YouTube that suggests you're insulting someone, that, even if you're actually not. So I'll give you an example. I just did a conversation with Peter Singer, and the thumbnail our team created was "You lie, Peter Singer." And I actually am not accusing him of lying. It's a joke. But it's the sort of thing that gets clicks because it draws attention when you see conflict between people. And Twitter is the worst about this. I mean, Twitter is just people ranting each other left and right. It's just, I think there's even empirical research showing that if you're insulting someone on Twitter, your engagement increases by like 8x. And I have to confess, I did just make a post about Tim Walz. That wasn't the kindest post. So maybe I shouldn't have done that. But before we go to social media, one question I have for you just at a high level is, what do you say to people who say there's some people who are not worthy of inherent moral worth? So a Nazi, for example, someone who expressly says, I think that people of other races are terrible and I want to wipe them off the face of planet Earth. Or, an avowed sexist who says, yeah, if women are things, they should just be slaves to men. I mean, how do you respond to an activist who says, like, that's part of our project? Our part of our project is to show that there are abusers out there. There are bad people out there who don't deserve that dignity.
Well, I mean, of course, we need to hold people accountable for problematic behaviors. I mean, that's what we do as activists. Like, that's our whole MO is, trying to create a world where it's no longer, seen as appropriate or possible to cause harm to others, to violate others. So we need to be able to hold people accountable. We need to be able to change the way people behave. We need to be able to enact legislation. There's no question about that. How we go about doing that, however, matters very much. And I believe it will, the more relational we are in our approach, the more swiftly and effectively we'll be able to create the kind of change we want to see in the world. Now, more specifically, to your point, how I would answer that question is we can hold people accountable and honor their dignity in the process. And this belief that somebody is morally superior to somebody else, that anybody is, has more inherent worth than somebody else, it simply reflects, a misunderstanding of human psychology and behavior. I mean, if you think about it, each and every one of us is nothing more and nothing less than the hard wiring and biology that we've been born with and every momentary experience we've had throughout our lives. Like, how could we be any different than who and how we are? So expecting someone to actually be different from who and how they are, it's like expecting a tree that's been rained on not to be wet. It doesn't mean we don't hold people accountable. We just don't hold people accountable and say, if I were you, I wouldn't have done what you did, because you would have. If I were born into Hitler's body and mind and life, I wouldn't be standing here, talking about how to create a more compassionate world. I would have been doing what he did. I'm no better, I'm no different than anybody else on this planet. And I would say that, who I am intrinsically is what I'm saying, is no better, it's no different than anybody else on this planet. And, often those of us who are, working toward compassion and practicing compassion look at other people who are not doing that and who are acting cruelly, acting against, our core values. And we feel morally superior because we're dealing with moral issues. I would suggest that having access to your compassion is a privilege. And, just think about how you feel after like one bad experience. Like, you're on hold with Verizon for 45 minutes and then you get cut off. Like, how likely are you to take this out on the next person you encounter? Like, we lose access to our compassion when we're suffering. And having access to, for me, being able to feel compassion and practice compassion is such a gift, and I'm so grateful for it. And I realize that it's a privilege that I have. So for me to look down on somebody who has less access to their compassion than I do, it would be similar to like looking down on somebody who has less access to food than I do. Like, why do that? So I think this is a really important message for people. We have all been born into a world that is organized around a myth that is the foundation of a lot of the violence that's going on right now. And this is what I call the myth of a hierarchy of moral worth. This is the belief that some individuals are more worthy of moral consideration, of being treated with compassion than others, and this myth, this belief lies at the foundation of all non-relational or oppressive systems, whether it's speciesism or patriarchy or, racism. It lies at the foundation of our mistreating each other in our own movement because we feel like somebody's done something bad, therefore they deserve to be treated badly. Even if you don't believe, or agree with me philosophically or psychologically, I also would suggest that practicing or opening your mind up to these ideas and practicing the formula is actually strategic. Study after study has shown that violating the formula, engaging in non-relational behaviors, is contagious. The more you do it, the more they spread. The more they spread, the more problems spread. So if you can commit to practicing the formula, you're watering the seeds in the world that you want to grow.
Yeah, both those points are so powerful and important, and it's such a strange thing for animal rights activists who our focus is so much on the inherent dignity of all living beings, for us to go out into the world and treat other human beings with insufficient dignity. And I say this as someone who's done it myself. I mean, again, maybe I just did it myself by tweeting. I just made this very negative tweet about Tim Walz. That was like kind of shaming, because did you hear about this turkey thing he did?
No.
Okay, it's been kind of going viral on Twitter. You're probably not on Twitter, which is good.
I'm not. Well, I mean, I am, but I'm not.
Not on Twitter. Yeah, not on Twitter as much as me, which is probably healthy. But so Tim Walz, so typically they do this turkey pardoning, but this year he decided not to pardon the turkey, but to eat him instead. And he made a big deal about it. He tweeted about it, and he made this tweet that was basically a picture of the turkey, and he's like showing this turkey to all these kids, and the kids are petting this turkey, and then he tweets, "Your days are numbered, brother," and it's like a joke, and everyone on all the animal rights activists on Twitter just going after him and saying like, this is super creepy, this is like wrong, and why are you proud, and laughing about the fact that you're going to send this turkey even on the day where historically governors pardon turkeys. Right. I'm going to send this turkey to the slaughterhouse and kill him, and right after having these kids pet them. And so, your instinct definitely is, and I have to say, I think there's an argument, at least for people who are not even just people, but they stand for institutions, for us to I don't want to say instrumentalize them, because they're still people. And at the end of the day, if I had a conversation with Tim Walz, I think I'd have an obligation, a moral obligation. And I think it would be strategically effective for me to treat him with dignity. But it can be a struggle, not just because of the social media platforms, because I think there's like a deep part of human psychology that actually kind of likes when someone has crossed certain boundaries, pointing it out and degrading them. I think there's like this weird schadenfreude we feel when someone, especially when someone's done something really bad. And for an animal rights activist, I mean, I can't imagine anything worse than going from pardoning a turkey to slaughtering them, where a turkey should have been saved and sent to a sanctuary, and you decide to send them to a slaughterhouse instead. So I guess, I mean, my question for you is, how do you get to the point where you can, even in situations where people are doing things that are really, really awful, where your emotional reaction is to say you're a scumbag and you don't have much moral worth? Like, what advice do you have? Because I think you're right that the evidence does show that if we can overcome that, especially in our interpersonal relations, and especially in when we're actually trying to persuade people, rather than just, I'm obviously, if you're just ranting among your friends, it's one thing, but you're actually going out there trying to change the world in some way. How do you overcome that, I think, almost deep psychological desire to kind of put bad people in their place? Like, what advice do you have as a psychologist in trying to overcome that impulse?
Well, right. That's $1 million question. I mean, first of all, in terms of posting on social media, a good practice is just to hit the pause button, before, when you know that you're in a place, when you know that you're triggered in some way or you're dysregulated. So we'll talk about this a little bit more, but just for listeners who are not familiar with this term, when you're dysregulated, that means your nervous system is out of balance. And dysregulation is a key driver of infighting in our movement and in the world, and a lot of the problems that we're talking about, a lot of the problems our world is facing. When you're can you
elaborate that? What does that mean for your nervous system to be out of balance?
It's like, so when your nervous system is out of balance, you're basically in a state of fight, flight, or freeze, right? And that's what being dysregulated is. And you could be mildly dysregulated, or you can be extremely dysregulated, which psychologists refer to as being flooded, right? And so when you are dysregulated, even slightly, what happens is that you have less access to your rational faculties, and you have less connection to your empathy. And, anybody listening is going to, know exactly what I'm talking about, because we're all in and out of dysregulation, throughout any given day. Dysregulation, it's a part of being human, at least at this point in time, and it is a big problem. It's a big driver of a lot of the issues that we're talking about and beyond. So, when you notice that you're getting upset about something and frustrated, hit the pause button before you communicate about it, because if you communicate when you're dysregulated, you're probably not going to be communicating in an optimal way. And, sometimes it's okay. Sometimes, when you're dysregulated, you have to communicate. And I really don't want people to think that the perfect is the enemy of the good, or make the perfect the enemy of the good. But certainly when we're posting publicly or communicating publicly, we're modeling. As vegans, we're still 1% of the global population. And, we're communicating in front of onlookers, 99% of whom are, probably not in agreement with what we're going to say, at least in some ways, not in agreement with what we're going to say, who have bought into stereotypes about us. And, and we're demonstrating to them, when we shame people, we're demonstrating to onlookers that were not safe people to be open around, And so this is sort of, to your point earlier, there's this sort of feeling inside people often of like, oof, I want an opportunity to take this person down, right?
Yeah.
Like, and yes, this is very common. It's very understandable. There are various reasons for this. And nevertheless, if we can recognize that when it happens and not act on it, we're in a better position to be effective ambassadors for our cause, because shaming behaviors, regardless as to who they're directed at. And getting back to what I said before I finish this thought, getting back to what I said about the hierarchy of moral worth and your point about animal rights activists talking about honoring the dignity of all beings, the part of us, this like ego part of our minds, however you want to describe it, that is attached to non-relational behaviors, to engaging non-relationally, will find some excuse as to why this individual here, this group here, doesn't deserve to have their dignity honored. It's just like, it's not about the content. It's not enough to simply look at who is demeaning or oppressing or abusing whom. We have to look at how and why we oppress and abuse and demean in the first place. And the reason is because we've bought into this belief that certain individuals are more worthy of being treated with respect and compassion than others. And you can see this, like some of the most compassionately oriented people, social justice crusaders, are doing exactly, doing to those who disagree with them exactly what they're decrying in the world. And the more we engage in this, the more we feed this mentality, the more we communicate in this non-relational toxic way, the more we water the seeds and normalize that kind of interaction. And the more we drive away potential supporters, because as I said, shaming behaviors are fundamentally non-relational. They're relationally dysfunctional. Shame is, and this is a big topic. And many of us in the world, and particularly those of us who have become advocates because we're thinking, actively thinking about how to get others to change their attitudes and behaviors, have inherited this belief that the way we get people to change is just by making them feel bad enough about what they're doing. If we can just make somebody feel bad enough about themselves for doing this or bad enough about this behavior, then they'll change. And the truth is, and what the research shows, is that people who feel even the threat of being shamed, let alone shamed, are people who become dysregulated. Shaming and the threat of shaming dysregulates people. And as I said, studies have shown that dysregulated people are less rational and less connected to their empathy. And just think about your own life. Like if you're interacting with somebody who's shaming you, you think is going to shame you, what are you going to do? You're probably a lot less likely to be vulnerable around them, to open your heart and mind to what they have to say. You're much more likely to want to withdraw or attack in self-defense, and certainly to shut down to their message.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I feel like one of the lessons of this most recent election is that shame doesn't really work that well, because there's so much of an effort to shame, various political figures and shame their supporters, and it almost caused a backlash in the opposite direction, which is super disappointing for a lot of us. I wonder if you think there's any value for shame, though, towards kind of institutions or ideas. Like, is it possible? So I think about something like Blackfish in SeaWorld, right? There was a lot of, and this might relate to the distinction you draw between anger and shaming behavior. That anger can be a healthy emotion and a healthy thing, while shaming, where you're basically denying the inherent worth of someone, that's where you've kind of gone too far, because you're shifting away from the behavior towards the person's inherent worth. So is there a way for us to shame institutions that is healthy and productive? So SeaWorld, for example, if we say like any company that is involved in this sort of practice of confining these beautiful, majestic whales and dolphins should be ashamed of themselves. We should see this company as lacking in moral worth. Is that something that's effective? Is that something you think there's room for?
I mean, it's a good question, and I don't have the perfect answer to it. I can tell you what the research shows just about shaming in general and just my opinion on this. But I think it would be really interesting to do some research on this. So institutions are made up of people, and people tend to identify with their institutions. Beyond Carnism, my organization, it's an organization. Obviously, I'm the founder, but even if I weren't the founder and I were just, a key staff person, I'd be identified with it. So if somebody says shame on Beyond Carnism, I would feel ashamed because I'm identified with it. So,
Yeah.
So I think we need to take that into account. And I think there are there are so many ways to raise awareness without shaming that I don't think we need to take that risk. It reminds me of something that I think it was Tom Regan who said when somebody asked him whether he ate invertebrates, we don't know that they have a nervous system. And he said, well, when the cost is so high, why take the risk? It's not necessary. I would say the same thing with shaming institutions. I don't think we have to. And because people are so there are different ways to do this. We can raise awareness. We can say, look at what's happening. And we don't have to use the word shame. We don't have to say shame. People are going to feel shame. In fact, even when we communicate in ways that are not shaming, if we're really, skillful in our communication and we manage to communicate in ways that are not shaming, sometimes people still feel ashamed. And at least we can say we stayed on our side of the street. But because we've all been born into such a toxic, relationally dysfunctional mess of a world, most people carry around a lot of shame. Most of them do. You just don't see it. And because most people hide their shame. They hide their shame from, others and they hide it from themselves. We're ashamed of being ashamed. The last thing this world needs is for us to water the seeds of shame in people who are already suffering from a highly destabilizing, very toxic emotion that is quite likely and has been suggested to be one of the leading drivers of a lot of problems in the world. Like most people had healthy self-worth and didn't carry around shame, they wouldn't be jumping on the bandwagon to put other people down because they wouldn't need to. Most of us get excited about putting other people down and the gotcha moments for calling people out who aren't good enough because we don't feel good enough on some level in ourselves. A world that's full of people who have healthy self-worth and are not riddled with shame is a world that would look a lot different than the one we have, and a lot more like the one we want to have. And so going back to your point, you raised a point about anger that I thought was important. And for listeners who aren't aware of the difference between anger and contempt, I just want to highlight the difference for them. Sometimes when people hear me talking about this issue about, practicing, being more relational, they think I'm telling people not to feel angry or saying that moral outrage is a problem. And that's not what I want to communicate at all. Anger is as you said, anger is a healthy emotion. Anger is the normal emotional response to witnessing something that we perceive as an injustice. And your anger is a sign that your moral compass is working, and it motivates you to take action on your own or others' behalf and to draw boundaries and demand change. The problem is not our anger, it's how we relate to our anger. When we relate to our anger in a healthy way, we recognize it for what it is. It's nothing more, nothing less than an emotion. It's a data point that's telling us that there might be an injustice going on here. When we relate to our anger in an unhealthy way, two things are present. One is that our anger is blended with us, where we don't say, I'm feeling angry and recognize it as a feeling. We say, I am angry. I and the anger are one. And a good way to, by the way, if you are feeling angry, to create some space between you and the anger is to say, a part of me is feeling angry. And that automatically creates some internal distance for you. So we're blended with our anger. The intensity of the anger is a problem. And another hallmark of the fact that we're relating to our anger in an unhealthy way is that it has the charge of contempt. So shame is the feeling of being less than. The feeling of being less worthy than others, of being treated with compassion and respect. Contempt is the flip side of this. It's a feeling of being more worthy than others, superior, morally superior. And, contempt is like judgment plus anger, essentially. And when you're in a place of contempt, this is a data point. It says more about you than the person you're feeling contempt about. When you're in a place of contempt, this means that you have lost your connection with your empathy and your compassion. It's impossible to look down on somebody when you're looking at the world through their eyes. So so this is something I think is really important for people to be aware of. And I also think it could be helpful for listeners if we differentiate shame and guilt, because a lot of people, they use these terms interchangeably, but they're not the same thing. Guilt is how we feel about a behavior. Like, we feel guilty when we think I did something wrong or I did something bad. And guilt is something that, like, it's important to feel guilty, because if you don't feel guilty, you don't course correct, and you don't feel remorse and you don't course correct. Shame is not how we feel about a behavior per se. It's how we feel about ourselves. We feel guilty when we think I did something bad. We feel shame when we think I am bad. And so when I say this, activists often say, aha, okay, so I'll guilt people instead of shaming them. However, I would advise against that, because, as I said, we live in a relationally dysfunctional mess of a world, and most of us automatically, as soon as we feel guilt, it morphs right into shame. Like, I did something bad, I feel guilty, I suck.
I feel terrible.
So we have to be careful, and we don't need to, because people in general, people who are not, who don't, they're not psychopaths, or don't have antisocial personality disorder, who actually are born with the capacity to feel empathy, and have moral values, basically wired in them in some way. They're already feeling, on some level, some degree of guilt when their behaviors are not in alignment with their actions. We don't need to make them feel guilty. We just need to highlight the contradictions in people's attitudes and behaviors, and that guilt will naturally emerge.
Yeah. Can you say more about kind of harnessing this anger in a productive fashion? Because one, I think most people would say, if we look at history or even kind of evidence of social movements, that anger is pretty important. I think it's Gandhi who said something along these lines, and I'm sure I'm paraphrasing, but it's something along the lines of, if you're not angry, you're not paying attention. There's something that's really bad that's happening in the world. And certainly, animal abuse is something I think, I probably agree people should be angry about. But say more about how you can harness that anger in a way that doesn't lead to contempt. Because I think it's not just natural for a person who feels guilty to feel ashamed. It's also pretty natural, I think, for people who are angry about some behavior to then also devalue the person engaging in the behavior, especially when you try over and over again. I'm sure a lot of people listen to this podcast have tried with their friends, their family members, with various institutions, to show them what's happening to animals, and people just don't respond. And I think it's hard. And I think you're right that we have to avoid delving into contempt. But how do you, is there space for anger at all? And what is that space? And if there is space for anger, how do we make sure it doesn't devolve into contempt?
Yeah, it's a really great question. And, first of all, again, I don't want the perfect to be the enemy of the good. Like, if you're going to feel contempt, we all feel contempt. We can't, at this, unless you're enlightened, you're going to feel contempt. The key is catching yourself when you do. And sometimes you won't catch yourself, and practice compassion toward yourself. If I could snap my fingers and do one thing, for our movement, it would be to help all activists to practice the formula toward themselves regularly and effectively. I think that would transform our movement in no time, right? So be really compassionate toward yourself when you're doing some of the things that we're talking about that are problematic, because we all do them, because we haven't learned not to, or how not to. And as you build your relational skills, which include, building mindfulness practices, and we can talk about that a little bit later, you'll be better and better able to catch yourself before your anger goes from 0 to 100, and so, and you will have the skills to self-regulate when you're dysregulated. One of the reasons people get stuck in anger and can't come out of it and start acting from a place of anger is because they don't have, they haven't caught the anger, in time. They haven't noticed that the anger's been building over time, or because they haven't built the skills, to relate to their anger in a way that helps them not end up fueling it and being consumed by it, but, really listening to it and trying to understand what it's trying to teach them, and then stepping back and not blending with it. And it's particularly difficult if you have a life where you aren't able to take care of your own needs. You aren't able to just basically get your basic relational needs and other needs met on a regular basis, right? So if you think, for example, about how you feel, like, let's say you've been on a red eye and, you're flying to a conference, you've been up for 2 days, because you didn't sleep the night before the flight because you had to get up at 2 a.m. to get to the flight in the first place. And then you've been flying overnight, and then you're jet lagged, and you're not eating well, and you're not sleeping well in your hotel, whatever. You know the feeling I'm talking about.
It sounds like every day of my life.
Right. Okay.
Unfortunately.
It's, you're just, it's hard to, or you've just had a fight with your partner, or a falling out with a family member, or, you're dealing with Uncle Bob who's teasing and harassing you because you don't support his hunting, whatever it may be. Like, when we're in circumstances that are dysregulating for us, it's really hard for us to build what I call our relational immune system, right? Or even just your let's call it your psycho-emotional immune system. We're weakened, we're depleted. And then every little thing is going to set us off.
Set you off, yeah.
So part of the key, and this is hard for activists because a lot of activists are, for good reason, that we're very conscientious. We care so much. We feel a very real, very true sense of urgency, to do as much as we can to save lives. And many of us are carrying around trauma because of the movement, or maybe, that preceded the movement, but or our experience in the movement, but was exacerbated by the movement. And it's hard for us to stay in balance and to bring ourselves into balance. So the more that you can create a life for yourself, and this takes, a certain amount of privilege, and there are a lot of things that you can do that are free to do this, that will make a big difference in your life, so that you're able to stay in a relatively regulated state and bring yourself into a state of regulation, the less likely you are to get hijacked by your anger and have it go off and running with you. So, for example, study after study has shown that, relationships, healthy relationships, fulfilling, connected relationships, even if you just have one or two of them in your life, the more we have the people, I should say, with fulfilling, connected relationships in their lives are people who fare better in pretty much every aspect of life. They are less at risk for various physical diseases, for, psychological problems, depression and anxiety. They live longer. They're more likely to succeed at what they start out to do. They're happier, so on and so forth. So giving yourself permission to invest in your relational well-being by building your relational skills, increase them by 5-10%, you could change your life, investing in your relationships. This creates resilience inside of you. So you're less likely to be off and running on the anger train when the anger understandably hits. Learn how to self-regulate. Learn what I call your dysregulation signature. And this is like I have on our website, infighting.org. I have a lot of information about dysregulation, what it looks like. Learn about what are the things that dysregulate you. How does dysregulation show up in your body when it happens? What is the story you're telling yourself when you're dysregulated? What helps to regulate you? Become an expert on your regulation and dysregulation. Check in with yourself 3 times a day. Ask yourself, am I feeling in balance? Am I feeling regulated now? Give yourself permission to do what you need to within, to the best of your ability to get yourself into a regulated state, because dysregulated people dysregulate people. Studies have shown that dysregulation is contagious, and we have a movement and a world that's full of people who are dysregulated and don't realize it, and don't know how to get out of a dysregulated state. And they're posting online, and they're communicating with other people, and they're yelling at people who disagree with them, and just spreading the dysregulation. So the good news is, and the takeaway for people listening is that, so often I hear from activists that they cannot prioritize their own well-being because the animals need them more. And what I would say is what the animals need is not a movement of walking trauma survivors or of chronically dysregulated and dysregulating individuals. They need a movement of healthy, self-connected people who are going to stay in the movement for the rest of their lives and not burn out and not turn into misanthropic, angry people who become ineffective or counterproductive ambassadors for the cause.
Yeah. Yeah, I think one of the things that was pretty marvelous about Martin Luther King Jr., and there's so many of the lessons from your work that I think I can see in the fork of the civil rights movement, but he was a very angry man. He talked about how I'm a very angry man, but he had control over it. Like he could turn it off and on, almost like a switch, because I think he had just done kind of the inner work and the relational work to ensure that he could harness his anger rather than allow his anger to consume him. And I think seems to me that's kind of what you're getting at. Have you seen the movie Inside Out or Inside Out 2 by chance?
Not Inside Out 2, because it wasn't in Germany when I last checked for it. But Inside Out 1,
you're gonna love it.
I can't wait. We've been waiting for this. My husband, Sebastian, and I.
Good.
Inside Out 1 was incredible.
On this point, right? It's, what you were saying about just observing it, just even saying things like anger is a part of me. Because, okay, I'm going to spoil a little bit. If anyone really wants to watch, can I spoil it to you just a tiny bit?
No.
All right, I won't spoil it for you. But I'll just say, just conceptually, the movie, both movies are basically about how there are certain emotions we have, and we have to name them and accept them about ourselves and observe them in ourselves before we can move on from them. And that suppressing these things and pretending they don't exist is just not going to help.
100%, totally.
And it's so good. It's such a good movie. Oh my God!
I'm so glad that you're
don't
giving
worry
a plug
that you
for
think
it here.
I know people think it's a little kid movie. It's totally not. Actually, I think it's based on real psychological research. I think both of these movies were written in part by psychologists, right?
Yes, and they would have to have been. They're just brilliant. They're brilliant.
They're really good.
There's a book that's called No Bad Parts. You and I were talking about this earlier by Richard Schwartz. It's also about recognizing those parts of yourself, like the inner parts of your personality that can get really activated and kicked up and really kind of hijack you so that you feel like you're like looking, this angry part of you, for example. And recognizing these parts can be helpful as well. And I think with anger in particular, it's just such a powerful emotion. But for all emotions, really learning how to tune into our emotional state, to not judge our emotions, to not try to push them down, to not try to force them away, but to really recognize this is a part of me, this exists for a reason. What is this emotion trying to teach me? And, trying to tell me what information is coming from this. And anger, as I said earlier, is a sign that you're potentially witnessing an injustice. Sometimes it's not an injustice. You're just angry at something that seems unjust to you, but it's not necessarily. And anger, and in particular contempt, right? Because this is the real problem, is contempt, not so much anger. But contempt and shame, they're not possible without a story. Like one can't exist without the other, right? You can't be in a state of contempt unless you believe that there's somebody who's less than you, more inferior than you. And these, the more people recognize this narrative, this story that we've all been taught to believe in, that some of us are just better than others, and really understand that we can hate behaviors, and be very want to change behaviors. But, the more we understand that people are who they are and they're doing what they do because of who they are and where they came from, the easier it is for us to unblend from that contemptuous anger and to stay in a place where we're just simply motivated to take action to change a behavior. And this is where mindfulness comes in, and, and developing an awareness practice, a mindful awareness practice, can be really life transforming, as you and I were talking about earlier. And we had talked about Sam Harris's app, Waking Up, which I highly recommend to people if you're interested, because it really does help to explain why this practice is so important and how to practice it.
Yeah. And for the record, my experience of mindfulness and meditation is, I think it's strange because it's one of the few areas in my life where I don't think I've been very perfectionist, and it's shown how not being a perfectionist can still have huge impacts. Because I try to meditate maybe 5-10 minutes a day. A lot of times I don't get to it, but it's still been hugely transformative in just my ability to control my own emotional states. Just spending 10 minutes, just being present, just observing. And like what I do, I don't know what your meditation practice is, and I'd be curious what your meditation practice is, but I've always just done body scanning, because that's just one of the things I learned early on, where you just go from the tips of your toes all the way to the top of your head, and you just observe, what am I physically feeling right now? And it's kind of shocking how often there are things you're feeling you didn't even realize. It's like, oh, like my hip feels weird. That's really weird. I didn't even notice it. Or like, oh, there's like this weird warmth in my feet today for some reason. I mean, have I been walking? Is there something wrong with my shoes? And it just helps you diagnose things. But even more than diagnose things, it just helps you escape from the weight of all the experiences, you know, because you're just taking a moment to reflect on the experience instead of being consumed by them. And I think that's really powerful. With that, can I ask you, do you have, I assume that you're meditating with waking up app. What is your practice and what do you try to do when you meditate and how much are you meditating?
Yeah, I mean, I think what you're describing is great because you're shifting from, the judger to the observer. And that's exactly what we're talking about with anger. It's not controlling it. It's not repressing it. It's not, you observe rather than judge.
Yeah.
I mean, I use waking up. I don't use waking up all the time for my meditation. I have different teachers that I follow and actually a teacher who I work with, individually, but I mean, actual meditation, I do a half an hour a day.
Nice.
And then I do other sort of mindfulness and, practices and, listen to a lot of talks. And it's, the kind of mindfulness I practice is, it's non-dual awareness. It's not mindfulness for relaxation per se. It's more of shifting, the way that Sam Harris would describe it. I think he describes it as kind of like creating a new operating system for your mind, like really learning how to shift out of this egoic way of thinking, like looking at the world through the eyes of this egoic part that thinks like, I am me, I'm this special self, Melanie Joy, and really sort of shifting into a deeper understanding of the nature of who you are and experiencing the world from that deeper part of you. And I'm not doing justice to this because it's very hard to describe, but it's called non-dual awareness, and sometimes non-dual mindfulness practice. And it's shifting, it's working on helping you shift your experience of consciousness. With it comes relaxation and it comes equanimity and, the things that we've been talking about. And it takes it, to a different, there's a different dimension to it as well.
Yeah. So after I meditated for many years, I started having this experience, and I can still get into this state pretty consistently where I'd feel like I was flying over my own self and I wasn't even me anymore. Like, and so I usually would take 5-10 minutes, but just, I would have this weird, and it was a really positive experience where it's like I'm some sort of angel just flying over me, observing me. And it's an odd feeling because on some level you still know it's you, but it's not you. It's like, and you lose your sense of self entirely. And I've heard my friend John, who's a lawyer, has told me that he tries to do that meditation, can't get there, but he gets there with various kind of psychedelics. And I know this is like a big thing now of, Michael Pollan and all these people. And I was telling you about my friend who does therapy for trauma for veterans who suffered horrible PSD. And actually, the thing he said he's found most effective is actually psilocybin and MDMA have been extraordinarily effective at changing people who have been traumatized and like trapped in this identity of fear. Everywhere I go, people are trying to hurt me because I was in a war zone and, had a horrible experience. And now like literally every sound, every car, every person you don't know is sending you spiraling down this fear trap. And then, this one moment of being able to step out of that, right? And just like say, oh, wait, that's not me in a sense. That's like, that's something for sure. I had this experience and it was really scary, but whether it's through psilocybin or some substance or through meditation, getting to the point where you kind of like detach yourself from the you think is you, and then suddenly liberates you and you're not trapped by the trauma. And he's had patients who's working on 20 years of more conventional therapy. And then one moment of just like getting out of their mind, whether it's through a substance or some other practice, has been really transformative them. So I think that's super cool that you're trying to do that. Can I ask you a question? That I think you're right about all the benefits of avoiding dysregulation. And yet we still live in not just personal benefits, but social benefits. Societies, live and die based on like how regulated their citizens are. Yet it seems to me we live in a world that's filled with dysregulation, and it's seemingly encouraged more and more, not just in social media, but even in politics and everything. So do you have a theory as to why that's the case? If dysregulation is so bad, why does it seem like so much of human civilization is encouraging us to be dysregulated?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's not my theory, but there's a lot of profit to be made by dysregulated people. I mean,
Yeah,
people
that's
who
true.
are like healthy and regulated and
Yep.
self-connected and fulfilled are not going to be
Yeah,
like,
they're not gonna eat the
going
junk
out to
food.
buy a new pair of shoes that they don't need
Yep.
because they've had a bad day,
Yeah.
probably. So, I mean, the whole kind of capitalist model is dependent on us, staying in a state of like feeling a lack of, feeling like we don't have enough and feeling chronically insecure.
Yeah.
And like we have to chase the next thing that's going to, regulate us. And you get these dopamine hits from
Yep.
consuming that then fade fairly quickly. So, I mean, this is a small part of a whole, but you mentioned earlier social media, and as you know, social media algorithms are structured to dysregulate us. And like, yeah, I mean, we know this, and this is the tricky thing because, as
It's
I
super
said,
scary.
communication is the primary way we relate, and the primary way we communicate is online, and online communication is literally structured to be dysregulating. It's structured to encourage us to be fearful and
Yeah.
contemptuous and dysregulated. And so honestly, like people cannot like not fight with each other online when they have a disagreement about what to buy for a baby shower. Like,
Yeah.
how on earth can we talk about like major life issues and like moral catastrophes and assume that it's going to like maintain some semblance of rationality and equanimity?
Yeah. So, I mean, does that mean we can't solve this huge problem with dysregulation unless we end capitalism? Do we all have to become socialists, Melanie? I mean, I'm serious question. Because I think with social media, it's the most apparent, but I
Mm-hmm.
think the temptation is because it does
Mm-hmm.
incentivize you to do things that are super contemptuous,
Mm-hmm.
shame-inducing, that dysregulate yourself and your audience, and just everyone's like,
Yeah.
"Ah, click, 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 click," you know?
Oh, totally. I mean, I'm not saying that capitalism is like, the be all end all of the dysregulation machine, but it certainly plays a role,
It's
and
part
it
of it.
like
Yeah.
largely depends on it too, at least for overconsumption. But
Yeah.
I mean, there are many things. I mean, the solution, there are many solutions. It's never just one thing. I would say that a fundamental part of the solution is building relational literacy. I think,
Yeah.
if our collective level of relational literacy weren't so low, we wouldn't vote for relationally dysfunctional leaders or relationally toxic policies. So the more relationally literate we become, the more relational literate the world becomes. And this is really, really important because we will, for better or worse, we are always contributing to the systems that we're a part of, the system that is our our intimate relationship, our family system, our work system, our movement, our world. And when we relate in a way that's healthy, we increase the chances that the other person's going to relate in a way that's healthy as well. Like if you're engaged with
Hmm.
somebody, interacting with somebody who's treating you with respect and is open and listening to what you have to say and not judging you, it's going to be easier for you to be your better self. And then you're going to pay
Yeah.
that forward. So I do think that I believe that if everybody, committed to practicing, which everybody won't, but we don't need everybody to do this, just like we don't need everybody to go vegan. We just need enough people to be vegan enough. And we need enough people to be
Hmm.
relationally literate enough. We'll shift the system and have, be able to help create a healthier world.
So how do we do that? How do we train people in relational literacy? I mean, obviously they can go to your website, they can watch Inside Out, which I'd recommend people do both of those things because those movies are great and your website's great. But
Yeah,
I
thank you.
suspect you would say that's not enough. You can't just read a website and then you're done. So I mean, what do we need to do collectively to make
Yeah,
sure
I
these
mean,
skills are actually developed?
thank you for asking that. So the website is, our website Beyond Carnism.org has links to our other websites, but the website that talks about relational literacy and regulation and dysregulation is infighting.org, and we have a lot of external links to places that provide tools like videos, for example, of how to self-regulate, how to co-regulate, meaning help somebody else regulate. So it's not enough just to read one website. And there people once you commit to this, once you commit to doing this work, there are lots of things you could do. I would say, check out, if you don't like the Waking Up app, check out apps and practices, look up non-dual awareness and mindfulness. There's so much online for free. Just great teachers. Adyashanti is one. Henry Schuckman is another. Locke Kelly is another. These are names, check out if you're interested. And build a mindfulness practice. Connect with free mindfulness communities. I have a book called Getting Relationships Right. It's a one-stop guide to building relational literacy. And it's something, if you're a vegan, your family is not interested in veganism, but you want to give them something to help them build their empathy muscle and think about how they relate to others, including other animals. This could be helpful. So the commitment, if the commitment is there, these are places you could come to our website. You could go to veganadvocacy.org. We have courses, that are low cost, free for anybody who needs them. Most of our materials all of our materials, except for the books, are free for people who need to access them for free. Courses and understanding whether you're traumatized or not and how to navigate that with resources. So if you commit to building relational literacy, you can access these resources. They link to lots of other resources, and there's just a tremendous amount out there. And I have found that building relational literacy, it's almost like, it completely changed my life. It's almost like, literacy, reading and writing. The world is a completely different place when you're literate. So the sky's the limit, and you don't have to do everything, I said, if you move the needle, if you improve your relational literacy skills by 5%, that could be really game-changing for you.
Yeah. I was just listening to this podcast of Mark Zuckerberg talking about artificial intelligence and what he's trying to do with Meta and Instagram and AI. And one of the really interesting things he said is that in terms of actual reading literacy and writing literacy, the LLMs and AI are actually getting really good. Where they suck is relational literacy. They don't understand emotion. They can't relate to people. And like in AI therapists, you quickly realize there's something just off about this. There's not, and one of the things Zuckerberg says is, and that's, we have to improve that, because most of the value in this world actually comes from this latter form of literacy, understanding emotions and being able to, appreciate what the right context is for your communication or your behavior. And AI, even as sophisticated it is, and all the hundreds of billions of dollars that invested in it, cannot build those skills while we can. And that's kind of amazing that we have the ability to do something that these $100 billion AI and technology labs can't even come close to doing. So I'd encourage people to take some of those resources and try to build some of these skills. But I'll ask you just about some test cases for the limits of relational literacy. And one is extremely high conflict people, right? So I was just reading this piece in the Atlantic about the dark triad of personalities, the combination of narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy. And I was actually shocked. The thing that shocked me about this, I've always known that there's like a subset of people who, I almost feel bad, who have these characteristics like extreme egoism, willingness to break moral boundaries, and lack of empathy for others. But the thing that shocked me was that apparently 1 in 14 people have these dark triad personality characteristics that, so I wonder, what do you think can relational literacy help us with these types of people? And what do we do with this, if this number is correct? I don't know if you agree with this assessment, but it seemed like a reputable source that 1 in 14 people have these characteristics. How can relational literacy help us with them, if at all?
Well, having characteristics is not the same as having the personality. Because these, personality disorder, like psychopathy or antisocial personality disorder or narcissism, there are a lot of people on the narcissism spectrum, or I don't remember what the percentage is, a very small percentage of people who would actually be diagnosed with NPD, narcissistic personality disorder. So having characteristics, is quite different. And that's why the number is so high that, you're sharing. That said, building relational literacy isn't just to help other people. It's also to help yourself. Like when you're more relationally literate, you recognize, like the formula for healthy relating. You start to recognize when people are not practicing the formula toward you. You're better able to set boundaries. Learning to set boundaries is a really important part of building relational literacy. Many people have, most of us don't relate to our boundaries in a healthy way. As Terrence Real, the psychotherapist, says, you need to have boundaries that enable you to be both connected and protected. And so, for people who are, more at risk, for example, of getting hurt by somebody who has narcissism, somebody who's got what's called porous boundaries. They're highly empathic, and they don't recognize it when people are treating them in a way that's not functional, that's non-relational. Building relational literacy can help them recognize that, help them learn how to put up boundaries and exit from unhealthy relationships. It's not going to change people. I mean, people who are, have psychopathy or who have a personality disorder, people who are, I'm not a fan of the term high conflict people, because I don't like reducing a person to a behavior, but somebody who engages in high conflict behavior, right, and who probably has serious mental health issues, you're not going to probably be able to heal your relationship with a person who's not willing and able to engage in that healing with you. And some people who have these diagnoses can't do that. But what you will be able to do is recognize, more quickly when and how to exit from unhealthy relationships.
Do you think that is the right path when you run into someone who's engaging in these conflict behaviors, that relational literacy is mainly just going to help you assess that, hey, I need to kind of step out of this, as opposed to trying to work with them and figure it out? And I guess it's probably case by case, but I don't know. What are your thoughts?
Okay. It's case by case. I do think a lot of times, there are people who have untreated mental health problems, or have treated mental health problems, or maybe, they're just engaging with others in ways that are highly problematic and highly non-relational. And, unfortunately, often those people are given a platform because not enough people recognize those behaviors for, as being as toxic as they actually are. And, one of the reasons is because we have bought into this myth of a hierarchy of moral worth. And we believe that if somebody is morally outraged, this gives them a free pass to abuse. And not be, held accountable for that abuse, or even see that abuse as abuse. So, but when we recognize that these behaviors are inherently problematic, when we don't celebrate and rally around people who are shaming and degrading others, and then it helps to not, some of these behaviors are really normalized right now, and it helps to eliminate the support we have for them, and reduce the chances that we're going to be victim of those.
How do we prevent that rallying around kind of people who are engaging in toxic behaviors, partly based on a sense of moral outrage? Because I don't know what your sense is. My sense is that it's almost, I think it happens on both the right and the left for sure, but it almost seems more common on the left, partly because on the left we are so sensitive to the idea that someone's harming someone else. And therefore, once someone says, I've been harmed, or I've identified someone who's harming others, we almost feel this obligation to rally around them, right? And I can say this as a person of color. I just feel like a lot of times this happens around race, for example, right? It's like, if a person of color says I see racism, it doesn't matter how mean they're being or how relationally illiterate their conduct is. I think all of us feel this intense pressure to support them because, we're anti-racist, we're leftists. So what is the solution to that? When you feel this pressure to kind of go along with someone because you believe in their cause and you believe in the general sentiment of whether it's anti-racism or whatever the cause is.
Yeah, you can support a cause and not support problematic behaviors, right? So, and I think this is true. It's true on the right as well. There's plenty of moral outrage on the right. The right's whole rallying cry is around moral outrage. It's just
That's true.
A different target and a different expression. But and herein lies, I think, the reason why it's so important for people to be able to identify non-relational behaviors, because if we can't identify them, if we don't see them for what they are, we get swept up in the charismatic, battle cries of people who are, standing for something that may well be something we believe in, but doing it in a way that's creating the opposite outcomes of, what we ultimately want.
Yeah. Why'd you decide to start working on this, by the way? Because, I mean, for the longest time, you were very focused on carnism and kind of naming the ideology of, some animals are animals we eat, some animals are animals that we care for, and the
Mm.
bizarreness of that. And this feels to me like I mean, obviously it's all psychology, but it feels like a big shift. So was there a reason you decided, like, I'm going to make this shift towards relational literacy and infighting?
Because I could, like, it was time. I
Mm,
think I felt like I had done enough work around raising. I mean, there's plenty of work to do around raising awareness of carnism, but I think
carnism,
in the
yeah.
movement, I recognized that it was really time to start this newer conversation, or it's different conversation. Carnism is a spoke on the wheel. Like, if you think about non-relationality, like, relational
Hmm.
dysfunction is, if you think about systems, right? Like carnism and speciesism and racism and patriarchy and classism and all of these problematic systems. And then also, like I said, dysfunctional systems and workplaces and families and movements, they're all structured in the same way. They're all non-relational. They're all
Yeah,
structured around this
interesting.
belief in a hierarchy of moral worth.
Yeah.
And they all have a very similar structure, and they all rely on the same non-relational mentality. So everything that we're talking about now is what drives carnism. And
Yeah.
my most recently published book is called How to End Injustice Everywhere, and
Mm,
it's basically the theory of carnism, but extended, to include all problematic isms. And it
mm,
looks at these problematic isms as being a reflection of and reinforcement of relational dysfunction, just on a collective level, that also
yeah.
get played out interpersonally. But I was motivated to do this work in part because I saw the harm that was being done to the movement. And
Hmm.
on infighting.org, we have some statistics, like very alarming statistics of, how much money and how many resources are being siphoned out of a movement that needs all the support it can get because of, this problem of relational dysfunction within organizations and across organizations.
Yeah. It's probably the area where I think the gap is biggest between people who have a lot of experience and have been inside the movement for a long time, and people who are sort of somewhere between passive supporters to relatively new advocates. In recognizing, like, what are the big picture issues that are preventing change. I think infighting is probably the number one thing, because I talk to leaders in organizations, people who have been funders of the movement for many years, and, like, it's always, if not number one, certainly near the top of the list of the things that we have to figure out. And you're also right that this is so many implications beyond just this one movement, because it's our entire society. Like, you
Yeah.
look at the most recent election, you look at, we just had Thanksgiving, and there's so many families that are falling apart because
Yeah.
of this relational dysfunction, the fact that they don't know how to relate to each other. And so it's a high order concern for the movement, for sure. I'm glad you're doing this work. What else have I not asked you that is important that you've been thinking about recently?
Thank you. No, I mean, that's it. We've covered a lot. We covered way more than I thought. And I guess I'll just sort of wrap up by saying, we are Beyond Carnism. We're a service organization. We're really in service of the people who are doing important work to create a better world for all beings. And, like, we exist to support that amazing work. So come visit us, and, like, we have lots of resources, and please, like, just avail yourself of the resources. And and thank you. It's been a pleasure, actually, and it's a really great conversation.
Yeah, and I can already attest to the value of it, because not just checking out the website, but some of the advice you gave me before we had this podcast conversation
Oh,
is pretty helpful. I'm gonna ask some of my team members to do this little task of writing down how I can improve my communication style with them, partly based on your advice on your website. So appreciate it, because I've already personally benefited from some of these ideas. Thanks so much, Melanie. Really appreciate the time. Can you just tell people, other than infighting.org, obviously, is there anywhere else people can follow you? Do you have a newsletter? Do you have any other ways for people to follow your work?
yeah, thank you. They could come to carnism.org, and we'll share our social links with you if you want to put them in the show
Yeah, I'll put them
notes.
in the show notes.
It'd be
Cool.
great.
Good stuff.
Great.
Thank you so much, Melanie.
Thank
Appreciate the
you.
time.
Thanks for
Yeah,
everything
for
you're
sure.
doing in the world. It's been such a pleasure. Let's keep
Yeah,
the conversation going.
for sure.
Okay. Bye.
We don't have to hurt animals. You can protect them. We don't have to kill them. We can care for them. And that's who we're meant to be, right? That's who we are when we're at our best. We're caring for each other and for the other living beings of this earth and not hurting them.